I want to have a look at the gospel from our Hebrew background and perspective, our Hebrew roots, because we have been grafted into essentially a Hebrew gospel by faith in Jesus Christ. In the early church, many of the fathers were Greek, and their understanding was often according to their Greek culture and background. And one of the results of this was that they spiritualized the gospel, and the gospel was more about me personally, my personal salvation, and about me going to heaven. But what was left out of that was the fact that God has a plan to transform this world, and this has been neglected a lot in our time today. When we look at the Hebrew gospel in the Old Testament, we see that when God brought Israel out of Egypt, it was a spiritual deliverance. They came to faith in him. They had the tabernacle among them with God's presence, his spirit living among them. But it was also a social deliverance. There was a lot of social change. And the Old Testament gospel was very much about land. That God gave them promises concerning this world, concerning land. And heaven and earth were united together in the gospel. And the gospel was holistic. It was spiritual, social, and about our nations and God's renewing of this world. It's the same when God delivered Israel from Babylon through Cyrus and restored them back to Jerusalem. It was a spiritual deliverance, but it was also a deliverance that regarded land. Again, it was a holistic gospel. So we need to understand the gospel in terms of this Hebrew perspective. We need a holistic vision, not only of spiritual things, but also of the blessing of those spiritual things, the blessing of heaven's presence, of God's presence in our lives, renewing our homes, our communities, our nations, and the world. We need a gospel that's not just about spiritual things, but about our land that we live in, our communities. And when we speak of land also, what do we mean by that? In the Old Testament, the land of Israel was a shadow. It wasn't the fulfillment. God's land, in reality, is the whole of his creation. Everything that's been made by God is to be renewed by him. So Abraham is not just called the father of the Old Testament land only, but in Romans chapter 4, Paul calls him the heir of the world. So the gospel blessings are expanding to all of the nations, all of the world. And just going back to the Greek fathers again of the church, one of the unfortunate differences in their understanding was that sometimes they felt that the church had replaced Israel of the Old Testament, and that led to what some people called replacement theology, that the church was now a Gentile possession, the gospel was now a Gentile possession. And this idea has sometimes contributed towards persecution of the Jews in church history, which is very wrong. It's a very wrong theology. And but also another Greek way of understanding the gospel is what is sometimes called dispensationalism. It says that God has rejected Israel for, say, the last 2,000 years, but in the last days, just before Jesus comes, he will restore Israel to their land and to God's favour. When we look at the New Testament, that doesn't go along with the gospel. Jesus announced the acceptance of Israel in the Gospels very clearly, not their rejection, that they were accepted back to God and into his kingdom. That's in fact why Jesus came, to redeem them through his death and resurrection. So Jesus also spoke about the land, particularly in the Sermon of the Mount, and he spoke of it in terms of the way we live. And the Old Testament prophets did this as well, that the land was a place where we live in harmony. It was a place where we love our brother, where we care for each other, where we care for people no matter what nationality they are, no matter what faith background they are, just that we love even our enemies. And Jesus spoke about this in the Sermon on the Mount. And where people do this is God's land, and God's plan through the gospel is that as it extends to all the nations become his land, and they all become redeemed and renewed. And in fact, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that in this way that the meek inherit the earth, or we inherit the land. So the picture of land we get in the Bible, in the Old Testament, or this holistic gospel as we call it, is one where the land spews out. It spews out people that don't love their neighbour, that don't follow God, that don't reflect God's kindness and God's nature to creation. But that the land is inhabited finally and fully and with blessing. It's inhabited by people who do God's will. God's creation is for people who do God's will, and these are the people that will inherit the earth and inherit his land.